She pressed her fingers against the pine lid of a stranger's coffin and whispered, the only prayer she had left, "Don't let this be the end of me too." If you've ever been left with nothing but your own two hands and the will to keep standing, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Clara's story all the way to the final word and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The wagon that carried Clara Everett into Redemption, Texas, rolled in just past the noon hour on the kind of summer day that made the air feel like something you had to push through rather than breathe. The driver, a leathery man named Hooper, who hadn't spoken more than 12 words the entire 3-day ride, pulled the reins and set the brake without ceremony. "End of the line, miss," he said. Clara climbed down on her own. She didn't wait for a hand. She had learned somewhere between Missouri and Texas that waiting for a hand was a good way to end up on the ground. She carried one bag. It had belonged to her mother, a worn brown leather satchel with a broken clasp that she held shut with her left hand out of habit. Inside it was everything she owned: a change of dress, a small tin of sewing needles, a letter she had read so many times the folds had gone white, and a photograph of a man she had never met. His name had been Harold Dean. Age 41. Widower. Rancher. The letter from the matchmaking agency had described him as steady, God-fearing, and in need of a capable woman to help run a household. Clara had been 21 years old, living in a boarding house in St. Louis on the last of her dead father's money, and she had answered that advertisement the same afternoon she read it. She had told herself it wasn't desperation. She had told herself it was a decision. There is a difference, and she had believed in that difference every mile of the journey. She stopped believing it the moment she saw Reverend Thomas Abernathy standing in the middle of the street with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in the particular way that men arrange their faces when they are about to deliver news they do not want to deliver. "Miss Everett," he said. He cleared his throat. "I'm afraid there's been a difficulty." Clara looked at him. She did not say anything. "Mr. Dean passed," the Reverend said. "3 days ago. It was his heart. The town is very sorry for your loss." Clara stood still for a moment. The photograph was in her bag. She had studied that photograph for weeks. The square jaw, the serious eyes, the stiffness of a man unaccustomed to being captured on film. She had built a life around that photograph, the way a person builds a house around a single beam, and now that beam was gone, and she was standing in the street in a town that was not her town, holding a bag with a broken clasp, and Reverend Abernathy was looking at her like she was a problem that had just arrived on the noon wagon. "I see," she said. "The agency should have sent word," he said. "I don't know why they didn't. I am truly sorry." "Is there somewhere I can sit down?" Clara said, "and perhaps get some water?" He took her to the church. He gave her water and a slice of bread and the kind of sympathetic silence that good men offer when they don't know what else to give. She was grateful for it. She sat in the front pew and looked at the plain wooden cross at the front of the room, and felt something very cold and very clear settle into her chest, the way river water settles into low ground. She was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of a man she had just met in a town that had no reason to care about her. She would think first and feel later alone when she had somewhere to be alone. The problem was immediate and practical. She had $11. She had no friends in Redemption, Texas. She had no family anywhere. The boarding house in St. Louis had already let her room to someone else. The agency had taken their fee up front and would not return it. She knew this without asking, because agencies never did. Harold Dean was in the ground, and his property would go to his nearest kin, which according to the Reverend was a cousin in Georgia who had already been sent a telegram. She was in every measurable sense stranded. She walked out of the church an hour later and stood on the main street of Redemption and took a long, even look at the town. It was not much of a town. A mercantile, a saloon, a livery stable, a barber shop, a handful of houses arranged without much intention along 2 dirt streets. The kind of place that had grown up around a water source and a crossroads and hadn't grown much since. The summer heat pressed down on everything, and the people who were out moved slowly, the way people move when the air costs something to get through. She walked to the mercantile first. She needed to think, and she thought better when she was doing something, even if the something was just walking through a door. The woman behind the counter looked up when Clara walked in. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled tight, and an expression that had not started out unkind, but had been worn into something close to it over many years. "Can I help you?" the woman said. It was not quite a question. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. "My name is Clara Everett. I arrived today. I was engaged to Harold Dean, but I've just been told he passed." The woman's expression shifted, not toward sympathy, toward something more complicated. "You're the mail-order girl," she said. "I answered a matchmaking advertisement, yes," Clara said. "He's been gone 3 days," the woman said. She picked up a bolt of cloth and began straightening it, a task that did not need doing. "The cousin's already been written. There's nothing here for you." "I'm not asking for anything that belonged to Mr. Dean," Clara said. "I'm asking about work. I can sew, I can cook, I can keep accounts. I'm good with animals, horses especially. I grew up on a working farm." The woman looked at her then. Really looked at her, at the fullness of Clara's frame, the plain cut of her dress, the practical lace-up boots the bag held shut with one hand. "We don't have work," the woman said. "Not for someone passing through." "I'm not passing through," Clara said. "I have nowhere to pass through to." The woman said nothing. She went back to the bolt of cloth. Clara stood there for one more moment, then turned and walked out. She tried the saloon next. The man behind the bar laughed before she finished her sentence. Not cruelly, exactly, more the way a person laughs at something that has simply never occurred to them as a real possibility. She thanked him and left. She tried the livery stable. The man there, a young fellow with a sunburned neck and kind enough eyes, shook his head and said he was sorry, but he answered to the owner, and the owner wouldn't go for it. She tried 3 other doors on the strength of pure stubbornness. Every one of them said no in one form or another. She was a stranger. She was a woman. She was the mail-order girl who'd arrived to a dead man and now had nowhere to go. And Redemption, Texas was a small town with a long memory and very little patience for complications. By the time she came back out onto the main street, 2 women on the other side of the road were watching her. They were not trying to hide it. One of them said something to the other, and both of them looked away when Clara looked back. Clara had spent 21 years learning how to keep her face still when something hurt. She kept it still now. She went back to the church. Reverend Abernathy was there writing something at his desk. He looked up when she came in. "No luck," he said. It wasn't a question either. Word traveled fast in small towns. "No," she said. "I need to think." She sat down in the pew again. The Reverend, to his credit, left her alone. She thought. She was not a woman who indulged in the luxury of panic. Panic was for people who had not already survived things. She had survived her mother's death at 15, and her father's slow unraveling afterward, and 2 years in a boarding house with $12 a month and a lock on her door that didn't quite catch. She had survived the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being capable and female in a world that wants women to be one or the other, never both. She could survive this, but she needed a plan, and she needed it before her $11 ran out. She thought about what she had. She thought about what this town needed. She thought about what she knew. And then she thought about what Hooper the wagon driver had said to her on the second day of the journey, when they'd passed a stretch of fence line so long and straight it had seemed to go to the edge of the world. "That's coal land," he'd said. "Runs all the way to the creek and back. Man runs 300 head and more horses than he can handle. Biggest operation in 3 counties. She had filed it away without knowing why. Now she knew why. She stood up. "Reverend Abernathy," she said, "which direction is the coal ranch?" He looked at her with something between admiration and worry. "Northeast," he said. "About 4 miles. But Miss Everett, is there a horse I could borrow?" "The livery has a rental mare," he said. "But Miss Everett Ethan Cole he's not an easy man. He doesn't take to strangers, and he's had 3 ranch hands quit on him this month alone. I wouldn't want you to—" "What did they quit over?" she asked. The Reverend paused. "The Stallion," he said finally. "He brought in a black stallion last spring. Thing is half wild, and the hands can't manage it. Cole won't sell it, and he won't put it down. 2 men got thrown. One got kicked so hard he was laid up for a week. Clara pulled the broken clasp of her bag closed and held it with her hand. 4 miles northeast, she said. Thank you, Reverend. She rented the mare from the livery for 50 cents and rode northeast under a sun that did not care about her situation at all. The land out past the edge of town opened up the way land does in that part of Texas, suddenly and without apology. She rode for nearly an hour before she saw the first fence, and then the fence went on for what felt like forever cedar posts driven deep into red clay earth wire running clean and tight. Someone cared about this fence. Someone checked it. She found the gate and the long drive beyond it and followed it until the ranch house came into view. It was a serious house, not fancy, but built with the intention of lasting. The kind of house that said the man inside it did not make decisions lightly. There were men working in the yard. 3 of them stopped what they were doing when she rode in. A 4th man came out of the barn. He was taller than she'd expected. Lean in the way that hard work makes a man lean, not the way hunger does. Dark hair, under a worn hat, jaw shadowed with several days of growth. Eyes that were very still in the way that the eyes of men who have seen difficult things sometimes go. Still not empty, but careful. He walked toward her with the unhurried stride of a man who owned the ground he was walking on. She did not wait for him to speak first. "Mr. Cole," she said from the saddle. "My name is Clara Everett. I rode out from Redemption. I need work and I understand you're short-handed." Something flickered in those careful eyes. "Who told you I was short-handed?" he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Quiet, without being gentle. "The Reverend mentioned it," she said. He mentioned the Stallion, too. The 3 men in the yard had stopped pretending to work entirely. A 4th appeared at the barn door. A heavy-set man, with a foreman's bearing, small eyes, and a mouth that had already started to curl into something dismissive. "You rode 4 miles out here to ask for work," Ethan Cole said. He was not asking whether that was true. He seemed to be considering what kind of person did a thing like that. "I did," Clara said. "You got experience. I grew up on a working farm in Missouri," she said. "Horses, cattle, pigs, the whole of it. My father ran 60 head before he got sick. I kept the books, the stables, and the kitchen for 3 years after he couldn't anymore." She paused. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work and fair wages." The foreman came out of the barn now. He stopped a few feet behind Ethan Cole and hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Boss," he said, "we don't need." "Gideon," Ethan Cole said without turning around. The foreman went quiet. Cole looked up at Clara on the rental mare. His eyes moved over her with the assessing quality of a man who had spent his life judging what a horse or a person could do by looking at them, and he was doing it now, not unkindly, but honestly. "What do you know about a horse that won't be handled?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know that a horse that won't be handled has usually got a reason for it," she said. "And I know that most men's answer to that reason is force, and force fixes it temporarily if it works at all, and it doesn't work on an animal that's been broken wrong to begin with." A pause. "I know you've had 2 men thrown and 1 kicked," she said. "And I know the horse is still here, which means you haven't given up on it. That tells me something about you." The yard was quiet except for the sound of the summer wind moving across the grass and the distant stamp of something large and restless from inside the barn. Ethan Cole studied her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Gideon," he said. "Show Miss Everett to the bunkhouse. She'll take the end room." The foreman's jaw tightened. "Boss, I really don't think—" "I don't recall asking what you think," Ethan Cole said, still quiet, still without turning around. "Show Miss Everett to the bunkhouse." He looked back up at Clara then. Something had settled in him, or perhaps it had opened, she couldn't quite tell which. "You'll start in the morning," he said. "Wages are fair. You'll earn them." "Yes, sir," she said. She climbed down from the mare on her own. She did not wait for help. She had learned somewhere between Missouri and Texas that waiting for help was a good way to end up on the ground. She took her bag with the broken clasp and followed Gideon Burke across the yard, and she did not look back to see if Ethan Cole was watching her go, though she knew that he was. Inside the barn, something crashed against the boards of a stall, a single massive impact that shook the wall and sent the other horses shifting and blowing. Gideon Burke flinched. Clara did not. She tightened her hand around her bag and kept walking, and somewhere in the dry summer heat of that yard in Redemption, Texas, something that had been ending quietly became something else entirely. Gideon Burke did not say a single word the entire walk to the bunkhouse. That silence told Clara more about him than any introduction could have. A man who resented being given an errand showed it in his shoulders, and Gideon's shoulders were carrying a weight that had nothing to do with labor. He pushed open the end room without ceremony and stepped back. "Supper's at 6, he said. "You're not late twice." "Thank you," Clara said. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has already decided he doesn't want around. His eyes moved over her the same way the mercantile woman's had the same inventory of her size, her plainness, her presence in a place he considered his. "You won't last a week," he said. Not mean exactly, just certain. "Then you won't have to look at me long," she said. He left. She set her bag on the narrow cot and sat beside it and let herself breathe for the first time since the wagon had rolled into Redemption that morning. It had been the longest day of her adult life. She was not going to think about Harold Dean or his cousin in Georgia or the two women on the street who had whispered. She was going to think about tomorrow morning and what she needed to do in it. She could hear the Stallion from here. Even through the walls, even across the yard, she could hear him not crashing now, but pacing the rhythmic strike of iron shoes on hard earth back and forth like something counting down. She listened to it until supper. The bunkhouse table held 7 men besides herself, and the particular silence that descended when she sat down was the kind that doesn't come from nothing. It comes from a decision from men who have agreed without speaking to see how a thing is going to go before they commit to a position. 2 of the younger hands glanced at her and then away. One older man with a gray beard and careful eyes gave her a small nod that she returned. The rest studied their plates. Gideon sat at the far end and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The cook, a thick-armed man named Pete, who smelled of wood smoke and bacon grease, set a plate in front of her without comment and went back to the stove. Clara ate. She didn't try to make conversation, and she didn't perform discomfort. She ate everything on her plate because she was genuinely hungry, and when Pete came by with the coffee pot, she held up her cup and said, "Thank you, that's kind." And Pete grunted something that might have been acknowledgement. After supper, the older man with the gray beard caught her at the door. "Name's Walt," he said. He kept his voice low. "Been here 11 years. You want some advice?" "I'll take it," she said. "Stay away from the black stall at the far end of the barn," he said. "Far end corner stall. That's Obsidian. He came in last April, and he hasn't let a soul near him since. Man named Rigsby got within 6 feet and ended up with 2 broken ribs. Cole goes in himself sometimes early morning, but even he can't get a hand on him." "What happened to the horse?" Clara asked. Walt looked at her. "Nobody knows for certain. Cole bought him from a seller who didn't stay long enough to answer questions. Horse was already like this when he got here." He paused. "Cole won't sell him and won't put him down. Some of the boys think it's stubbornness. I think it's something else." "What do you think it is?" she said. Walt considered. "I think Cole sees something in that horse he recognizes," he said. "Don't know what. But I think that's it." He went back inside. Clara stood in the yard for a moment in the dropping dark of the summer evening, listening to the Stallion pace. She went to bed early and woke before dawn. She dressed in the dark and went to the barn while the sky was still more black than blue. She did not go to the far end. She went to the nearest stall and began with the mare that was hers to manage for the day, checking feet, checking feed, checking the set of her ears for any sign of trouble. She worked quietly and thoroughly the way her father had taught her, without rush and without noise. She heard him before she saw him. Ethan Cole came into the barn at first gray light, moving with that same unhurried stride, a lantern in one hand. He stopped when he saw her already working. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. She didn't stop what she was doing. He watched her for a moment. She could feel it without looking the quality of his attention the way he assessed without announcing himself. "Walt talked to you last night," he said, briefly. "What did he tell you?" "To stay away from the far stall," she said. "Obsidian." A pause. "Good advice." "I know," she said. "I'm not going to ignore it." She set the mare's foot down and straightened. "Not yet." Something in the barn shifted. The pacing from the far end had stopped. She wasn't sure when exactly, sometime in the last minute or two. The silence that replaced it was a different kind of silence, the listening kind. Ethan Cole looked down the length of the barn toward the far stall. His expression was the same careful blankness it had been yesterday, but the line of his jaw had tightened by some small degree. "Not yet," he repeated. "A horse that won't be touched doesn't need another person rushing at him," she said. "He needs someone willing to wait. I'm good at waiting." He looked at her. Then that same assessing look, that same quality of a man deciding what something is made of. "Breakfast is at 7, he said. "After that you'll work the north pasture with Walt and Hector. There's 6 mares that need moving to the east field, and the fence along the creek line needs walking." "Yes, sir," she said. He went to the far end of the barn. She did not follow. She heard him stop outside Obsidian's stall, heard the low sound he made, not quite a word, not quite a sound, somewhere between the two, and heard nothing in response from the horse. No crashing, no pacing, just that listening silence. She went back to work. The morning passed hard and honest. Walt and a young Mexican hand named Hector worked alongside her without ceremony, and she matched them step for step. Moving 6 mares sounds simple until you're doing it in summer heat with animals that have opinions about where they're going, and by the time the fence line was walked, and every break marked and every gate checked, the sun was straight overhead, and all 3 of them were soaked through. Hector, who was maybe 19 and had a quick, dark-eyed wariness about him that reminded Clara of a young colt unused to being spoken to, gently said his first words to her just past midday. "You know horses," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, more an acknowledgement of a fact he hadn't expected to be a fact. "I grew up with them," she said. "Where, Missouri, farm outside of Hannibal." He nodded and said nothing else, but something in the wariness had eased slightly, the way a door eases when the latch is lifted. Walt beside her said quietly, "That's more than he said to anybody new in 2 years." She smiled at that. First time she'd smiled since morning. They came back to the yard to find 2 of the other Hands brothers named Cal and Denny, both in their mid-20s, both with the permanently sunburned look of men who'd been outside their entire lives, leaning against the water trough, having a conversation that stopped the moment they saw her. "How'd she do?" Cal said to Walt, as though Clara weren't standing right there. "Fine," Walt said. "Fine like she didn't fall behind, or fine like she actually pulled her weight. Fine like she spotted the break in the creek fence before I did," Walt said. "So you can decide what that means." Cal looked at Clara with a new expression, not friendly yet, but recalibrating. Denny just looked at his boots. Gideon was coming across the yard. He had seen the exchange, and the set of his face said he did not like what he'd seen. "Cole wants the gray gelding reshod this afternoon," he said, looking at Clara. "You said you know horses. Prove it. You can hold him while the farrier works." The way he said it made clear he expected this to be a problem. The gray gelding was known to be difficult. She'd already heard the Hands mention it twice that morning. "Where's the farrier?" she said. "Coming at 2. "I'll be there," she said. Gideon's jaw moved slightly. He hadn't expected that answer. He'd expected negotiation or hesitation, and she'd given him neither, and it had taken something from him that he'd been counting on having. He walked away. Walt leaned close. "That gelding kicked a man in the knee last month," he said low. "Gideon knows that." "I know," Clara said, "but Gideon doesn't know what I know." She spent the hour before 2 o'clock, watching the gray gelding from outside his paddock, doing nothing else. Just watching. He was agitated in the particular way that horses get when they anticipate something unpleasant. Short movements, ears back and forward, eyes rolling at the edges. He'd been shod before, and something about it had gone wrong, and now the memory of it lived in his muscles. When the farrier arrived, a short, barrel-chested man named Amos, who carried his tools with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, Clara was already in the paddock. "You the one holding?" Amos said. "Yes." He looked her over. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. She did not grab the gelding. She stood at an angle to him, not facing him head-on, not pressing toward him, just present and still. She let him investigate her for a full 2 minutes before she moved. She spoke to him in a low, continuous murmur. Not words exactly, just sound, the way you fill silence for someone who's frightened of it. By the time Amos lifted the first hoof, the gelding was breathing differently. He didn't kick once. Amos packed up his tools at the end and said without looking up, "Where'd you learn that?" "My father," she said. "He a horseman." "He was," she said. Amos nodded. "Good man, then." He left. Clara turned and found that Cal and Denny had watched the whole thing from the fence, and behind them farther back, Ethan Cole had been standing in the barn doorway. She didn't let her expression change. But she felt it, the particular warmth of being seen doing something well by someone whose opinion, for reasons she hadn't fully examined yet, had started to matter. Gideon was not at the fence. Supper that night was different. Not dramatically, nothing in the bunkhouse shifted all at once. But Cal asked her to pass the bread, and said her name when he did it. Hector sat closer. Walt refilled her coffee without being asked. These were small things, the smallest kind of things, and Clara understood exactly what they meant, because she had spent her life reading the small things that people do when larger words are too much to say. She was not welcome yet, but she was no longer entirely unwelcome, and in a place like this, that was its own kind of progress. She went to bed that night and listened to the Stallion. He was quieter than he'd been the night before. Less pacing, longer silences between movements. She lay in the dark and thought about what Walt had said. I think Cole sees something in that horse he recognizes, and she thought about the way Ethan Cole had stood at that stall in the early morning dark, making a sound that wasn't quite a word to an animal that wasn't answering. She was up before dawn again. This time she went a little farther into the barn before starting her work. Not to the far end she'd meant what she said about waiting, but farther than yesterday. She moved through the barn quietly, checking on each horse in turn, pausing at each stall long enough to make her presence ordinary. Not threatening, not purposeful, just present. She was 3 stalls from the far end when she heard the Stallion stop moving. She stopped too. She stood completely still. She didn't look toward the stall. She kept her hands loose at her sides and kept her breathing even and let 30 seconds go by in perfect silence. The Stallion's nose appeared over the stall door. Not coming toward her, just appearing. Just looking. A broad black face with an eye so dark it absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Watching her with the total, unblinking attention that horses give to things they haven't decided about yet. Clara did not move toward him. She did not make a sound. She simply existed in his vicinity for another full minute, and then she walked slowly back toward the barn entrance and went on with her morning. She did not tell anyone what had happened. Ethan Cole arrived at the barn 20 minutes later. She was already working. He stopped, and she could feel him reading the barn, the way he always did, taking in every sound, every position, every horse's posture, and she wondered if he noticed anything different. He came to stand near her stall. "How'd you find the gelding yesterday?" he said. "Manageable," she said. "He's not mean. He's scared. There's a difference." "Amos said you were good." "Amos was easy to work with," she said. "A good farrier makes the whole thing easier." He was quiet a moment. "Where'd you learn to read a horse like that?" "My father," she said. Same answer she'd given Amos. But this time she added, He always said that if you want to know what a horse is feeling, stop looking at what it's doing and start listening to why. Ethan Cole was quiet long enough that she looked up at him. He was looking down the barn toward the far stall. His expression had done that thing it did not changing exactly, but shifting beneath the surface like something moving under ice. "That horse," he said, "came from a man who'd had him for 2 years. Seller said he'd been fine until about 8 months before I bought him. After that, he wouldn't let a soul near him." He stopped. "I never did find out what happened in those 8 months." "You don't have to know exactly what happened," Clara said. "You just have to know that something did." He looked at her. "Most people want an explanation," he said. "A reason. They want to know the story so they can decide what to do with it." "Most people are afraid of things they can't explain," she said. "That doesn't mean the thing needs explaining before it deserves patience." Something moved behind his eyes. Quick and gone like a fish turning in deep water, he put his hat on and walked back toward the barn entrance. "North pasture fence needs the second section walk today," he said over his shoulder. "Walt knows where." "Yes, sir," she said. He was gone. She went back to work. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. That afternoon, Gideon Burke made his next move. She was coming back from the second fence walk, Walt and Hector beside her, when Gideon intercepted them in the yard. "Cole needs Walt at the house," he said. "You two finish up the feed distribution." Walt looked at him. Something in his expression said he didn't quite believe the errand, but he touched his hat and went. Hector and Clara took the feed cart to the north barn together, and Gideon followed. She knew immediately that something was different. The way Gideon moved purposeful, waiting for something, put a quiet alertness in her chest. It came clear 10 minutes in. She was measuring out grain when Gideon said from behind her, "Cole's going to get tired of this experiment." She kept measuring. "That's so." "You think you're something special because you held a gelding for the farrier and walked a fence line without getting lost," he said. "But this is a working cattle operation. It's not a place for—" He paused, and the pause was pointed. "Women who don't know their place." She set the measure down. She turned and looked at him directly. "What is my place, Mr. Burke?" she said. He hadn't expected her to look at him like that, straight and steady, without any of the flinching he'd anticipated. "Not here," he said. "You've made that clear," she said. "You've made it clear every hour since I arrived, and yet here I am." "Cole will see reason," Gideon said. "A woman on a working ranch is a distraction and a liability. I've told him that." "And what did he say?" she asked. Gideon's jaw worked. He didn't answer. "Mr. Burke," Clara said, "I came here with nothing, and I asked for a fair chance at honest work. I'm giving everything I have to do this job well. If Mr. Cole decides I'm not suited, he'll tell me himself. Until then, I'd appreciate being left to do the work I was hired to do." She picked up the measure and went back to the grain. Gideon stood there for a moment. Then he said, "The stallion's water bucket needs emptying and refilling. It's inside the stall." She stopped. "The other hands won't go in," he said. She could hear the satisfaction in it. "Cole told me to find someone. Congratulations, Miss Everett. You volunteered." This was the test. She understood it completely, the shape of it, the intention behind it. If she refused, Gideon had what he needed to tell Ethan Cole she couldn't pull her weight. If she went in and it went badly, same result. Either way, Gideon won. She set the measure down a second time. "Show me the stall," she said. Gideon blinked. He had not expected that either. He'd expected argument or fear, and he'd gotten neither, and it had thrown him off the calculation he'd been running. Hector, who had been silent in the corner, said quietly, "Miss Clara, you don't have to—" "I know," she said. "Show me the stall, Mr. Burke." Gideon took her to the far end of the barn. The stallion heard them coming. Before they were halfway there, she could hear him shift, heard the hard stamp of one hoof on the packed earth. A warning. He knew the difference between footsteps, she realized. He'd already cataloged every person on this ranch by the sound of their approach. Gideon unlatched the stall door. The top half was already open. He stood back and gestured with one hand. Clara did not go in immediately. She stood at the door and looked in, and the stallion was at the far wall, head high, every muscle rigid. His dark eye fixed on her with the absolute focused intensity of an animal deciding whether something is a threat. He was magnificent. She had known horses her whole life, and she had never seen one quite like this, not just in size or in color, but in the quality of his presence, the sense of something enormous barely contained. "Obsidian," she said softly. Not a command, just his name. His ear moved, just one, rotating toward her like a compass finding north. She did not step in. She stayed at the doorway, her hands at her sides, and she talked to him. Not about anything about the heat that day, about the fence line she'd walked, about a horse she'd known as a girl named October, who had been just as large and just as certain of his own importance. Her voice stayed low and even, and she kept her body language loose, unhurried, taking up no more space than she needed. A full 2 minutes passed. Then she stepped in. Obsidian threw his head once. She stopped immediately and waited. He held his position. She waited. His breathing was loud in the close space of the stall, great bellowing inhalations, and she could feel the heat radiating off him from 6 feet away. She waited until his head lowered by 1 inch. Then she moved to the bucket. She lifted it, took it out of the stall, filled it at the trough, while Gideon watched with his arms crossed, brought it back in, set it down. She moved out of the stall without turning her back on the horse, latched the door, and turned around. Gideon's arms had uncrossed. He was staring at her. "He didn't charge," he said. "No," she said. "He charged Rigsby from 10 feet out." "I know," she said. "How did you—" "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just didn't give him a reason." She picked up the feed measure from where she'd left it and went back to the grain distribution, and Hector was looking at her with something in his young face that she recognized after a moment as the specific expression of someone revising a belief they'd held without examining it. Gideon Burke stood at the far end of the barn for a long time after that. She could feel the shape of what he was thinking from across the barn, the same way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. He had pushed her toward that stall to be rid of her. Instead, he had handed her something she hadn't had before, proof witnessed undeniable. She had walked into the stall that no other hand on this ranch would enter, and she had walked back out again, and Hector had seen every second of it. By morning, everyone would know. She finished the feed distribution and went to wash up before supper, and she was at the water barrel outside the bunkhouse when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Ethan Cole standing in the yard. He was looking at her with an expression that had changed from anything she'd seen before. The careful blankness was still there, but beneath it something had cracked slightly open, a line of something warmer, showing through the way a lamp shows through a shutter that hasn't been fully closed. "Gideon told me what happened in the barn," he said. She waited. "He told me he sent you in to change Obsidian's water," he said. "He told me you did it." "Yes, sir," she said. "He also told me I shouldn't read too much into it." Ethan Cole's jaw moved slightly. "He said it was probably luck." "It wasn't luck," she said. "But I understand why he'd say that." Ethan Cole looked at her for a long moment. The summer dark was settling in around them, and the yard was going quiet, and somewhere in the barn, the stallion was still genuinely still, she realized for the first time since she'd arrived. No pacing, no crashing, just stillness. "I've had that horse for 4 months," Ethan Cole said. "I've spent more mornings in that barn than I can count. I've never gotten within arm's reach of him." He stopped. "You changed his water." "He let me," she said. "That's different from me getting close. I didn't get close. He just decided I wasn't a threat." "Why?" She considered. "Maybe because I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said. "I wasn't trying to show him I wasn't scared or show him I was in charge. I was just there, doing what needed doing." Ethan Cole looked at her for so long that she began to wonder if she'd said something wrong. Then he said very quietly, "That's harder than it sounds." "Yes," she said. "It is." He put his hat on, though he was already wearing it, the way men sometimes reach for a hat as a way of reaching for composure. "Breakfast at 7, he said. "Yes, sir," she said. He walked back toward the house, and Clara turned back to the water barrel, and her hands, when she looked at them, were perfectly steady. She was still there. More than that, she had begun in the smallest and most solid way possible to matter. Inside the barn, Obsidian stood without moving, and the silence he held was a different kind of silence than the one he'd carried for 4 months. It was the silence of an animal that had for the first time considered the possibility of trust. 3 days passed, the way hard work passes without ceremony, without pause. One task bleeding into the next, until the body stops asking questions and just moves. Clara was up before dawn every morning. She worked the fence lines with Walt and Hector, managed the mare rotation, kept the feed records in a hand so clean and organized that Pete the cook, who had been doing it badly for months, handed her the ledger on the 4th morning without being asked and never took it back. She did not ask for recognition. She did not position herself for it. She simply filled every gap she found, and the gaps were many, because a working ranch with short hands and a difficult foreman develops gaps the way old boots develop holes quietly in the places nobody's looking. Gideon watched all of it. She could feel his attention the way you feel a splinter you haven't been able to get out, not constant agony, but always there, always reminding you it hadn't gone anywhere. He hadn't sent her into another dangerous situation since Obsidian's stall. She didn't think that was restraint. She thought it was recalculation. What she did not yet know was what he was calculating toward. On the morning of the 5th day, she went farther into the barn. She had been moving by degrees, a foot closer each morning, timed to nothing but Obsidian's breathing. His ear positions, the particular quality of his stillness. This morning, she stopped 2 stall lengths away and simply sat down on a hay bale at the edge of his sight line and opened the feed ledger and worked on it there in his vicinity, doing something ordinary and absorbing. She heard him stop moving before she'd been there 5 minutes. She didn't look up. She kept writing. Numbers down the column notes in the margin, her pen moving steadily across the page. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. When she finally looked up, Obsidian's head was over the stall door, and he was watching her with both ears forward, not defensive, not alarmed, just watching. "Morning," she said quietly. He didn't move. She went back to the ledger. When Ethan Cole came into the barn at first light and found her sitting 10 feet from Obsidian's stall, doing paperwork, he stopped so completely he might have been turned to stone. She looked up. "I needed somewhere quiet," she said. He stared at her for another moment. Then carefully, he came to stand beside her and looked at the stallion. Obsidian's ears flicked toward him once, then returned to Clara. "He's watching you," Ethan said. "He started about 10 minutes in," she said. "He'll stop eventually. Or he won't. Either way's fine." Ethan Cole crouched down beside the hay bale, not sitting, just lowering himself to her level, the way a man does when he's thinking and needs to get closer to what he's thinking about. He looked at the stallion for a long time. "He was in a fire," he said. "That's what I found out. 2 weeks after I bought him, I tracked down the man who owned him before the seller. Took some doing." He paused. "Fire took half the barn. Horse got out, but 3 others didn't. He stood outside that barn for 6 hours. Wouldn't let anyone near him. When they finally got a rope on him, it took 4 men and it went badly." Clara set the ledger down on her knee. "How old was he when it happened?" she said. 4. He's 6 now. So he's been like this for 2 years, she said. And the last thing he remembers about people getting close is 4 men and a rope. "Yes." "And you've been trying to reach him for 4 months." "Yes." She looked at the stallion. "You weren't going to give up on him," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Ethan said. "Why not?" A long pause, the kind that says more than the words that follow. "Because he didn't do anything wrong," Ethan said finally. "What happened to him wasn't his fault. Didn't seem right to make him pay for it forever." Clara looked at him, then sideways carefully, the way you look at something fragile that you don't want to startle. "No," she said. "It doesn't seem right." Ethan Cole stood up. He put his hat on. He walked to the far end of the barn and stood outside Obsidian's stall for a moment, and the stallion looked at him, and neither of them moved. And then Ethan walked back out into the morning. Clara sat with the ledger in her lap, and the warmth of what she'd just learned settling into her chest like the first real heat of a fire after a long cold. She understood Ethan Cole now. Not all of him. She'd have to be a fool to think she understood all of a man that layered in a week. But the shape of him. The architecture. He was a man who did not abandon things that had been damaged through no fault of their own. She went back to the numbers in the ledger and tried to concentrate. By that afternoon, everything had changed. It started with a sound she had never heard before and would never afterward mistake for anything else. A sound that came from the direction of Obsidian's stall just after the noon hour, when most of the hands were at the water trough, and Gideon was somewhere by the equipment shed. It was a crash, but not the crashing she'd heard before the frustrated impact of iron hooves against wood. This was different. This was the sound of something large going down. She was moving before she'd made the decision to move. She got to the barn door at a run and stopped herself just inside, forcing her pace down to fast and controlled, because the worst thing you could do in a barn with a down horse and other horses was come in panicked. She moved fast and quiet to the far stall and looked over the door. Obsidian was on his side, not thrashing. That was the first thing she checked. A horse that goes down thrashing is a horse in the worst kind of trouble. He was on his side, breathing in the hard, labored way that said the breathing itself was costing him, and his legs were moving in slow, disoriented cycles, not fighting, just lost. "Ethan!" She shouted it without thinking the first name out of her mouth before she could reach for the other. "Ethan, get to the barn!" She unlatched the stall door. She heard Walt shout something outside. She heard running feet. She was already inside the stall. Obsidian's eye found her immediately, that enormous dark eye, and what was in it was not the thing that had been in it before. Before, when he looked at her, there had been wariness and assessment, and the slow-building willingness to wait and see. Now there was something rawer than that. Something that looked, if you were the kind of person who believed an animal could feel it, very much like fear. "I've got you," she said, low, even. "I'm right here. I've got you." She went to her knees beside him. She put her hand on his neck the first time she had touched him, and felt the heat of him, the trembling that ran through every muscle in long, slow waves, and she kept her hand there and kept talking. "I've got you. I know it hurts. I'm right here." Ethan Cole came through the stall door at a controlled run and stopped the moment he saw them. Clara on her knees, her hand on the stallion's neck, Obsidian's eye fixed on her face. For 1 second he just stood there. "What happened?" he said. "He went down. He's not thrashing, but his breathing is wrong. Could be colic, could be something else. We need Amos or whoever your nearest horse doctor is." "Doc Hale, he's in town. 20 minutes. "Send someone now," she said. "Fast." Ethan was already turning. "Walt, ride for Doc Hale now. Everything you've got." Walt's feet hit the ground running before the words were finished. Gideon appeared in the stall doorway. His eyes went from Obsidian to Clara to Ethan, and the calculation in them was almost visible. "Cole," he said. "If it's colic, we should be talking about—" "Not now, Gideon," Ethan said. "The horse has been nothing but—" "I said not now." Ethan's voice didn't rise. It dropped, actually, in that specific way that a voice drops when what's behind it has no room left for argument. Gideon's mouth closed. Clara was watching Obsidian's breathing. "Get me the leather halter from the hook by the main door," she said to no one in particular. "The softest one you have. And water. Bring water." Hector appeared. He was gone and back with both in under a minute, moving with the quick decisiveness of a young man who has found something worth being useful for. "Thank you," Clara said. She dipped her hand in the water and pressed it to Obsidian's lips. He didn't drink, but his tongue moved. She did it again. "Why the halter?" Ethan asked. He was crouched now on the other side of the horse, one hand on Obsidian's flank, feeling for the breathing rhythm. "When Doc Hale gets here, he may need to work fast," she said. "If we have to get Obsidian up, we need some way to guide him without fighting him. If I put the halter on now while he's calm with me, he'll be wearing it before he's frightened." Ethan looked at her across the body of the horse. "You think he'll let you?" "I think he's scared enough right now that he's not going to fight the person who's been sitting with him." She paused. "Fear does that. Makes you willing to trust what you wouldn't trust before." She moved carefully, incrementally, the halter in both hands, talking the whole time, and Obsidian let her. His head lifted once and she waited, and it came back down, and she put the halter on him with hands so steady she might have done it 1,000 times on this particular horse. And when she buckled the last strap, she let out a breath so quiet, only someone watching very closely would have heard it. Ethan Cole heard it. He was watching very closely. The next 40 minutes were the longest Clara had spent in years. She stayed at Obsidian's head. Ethan stayed at his flank, monitoring breathing, checking gut sounds, with his ear pressed to the horse's belly, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing this since boyhood. The other hands filtered in and out of the barn doorway, drawn by the crisis, and kept at a distance by Ethan's single sharp look. Gideon hovered. That was the only word for it. He hovered near the stall doorway with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the particular expression of a man waiting for something to go wrong, so he can say he saw it coming. Doc Hale arrived in 42 minutes flat, Walt riding hard behind him. He was a slight white-haired man who moved with the brisk economy of someone who has dealt with crises long enough to stop being afraid of them. He came into the stall, assessed the situation in 30 seconds, and then said to Clara, "You put that halter on him." "Yes, sir." "How long has he been down?" "Close to an hour." "He let you stay with him?" "Yes, sir." Doc Hale looked at her with a sharpness that was not unkind. "Don't move from that spot," he said. She didn't move. What followed was the kind of work that tests everything: the horse's endurance, the handler's nerve, the bystander's capacity for helplessness. Doc Hale worked with focused precision, and Clara talked to Obsidian without stopping a low, steady river of sound that she barely had to think about. It came so naturally, and the horse kept his eye on her face through all of it. At one point, when Doc Hale administered the medication that would begin working on the blockage, he'd confirmed Obsidian's whole body seized with a single violent shudder. His legs came up and Clara leaned over his neck and held the halter and said steady and clear, "I've got you. You're not alone. I've got you." And the shudder passed. Ethan Cole, across the horse, looked at her, and for one unguarded moment, his face was completely open. None of the careful stillness, none of the managed distance. Just a man watching something that had moved him past the place where composure lives. He looked away first. Doc Hale straightened up after another 20 minutes. "He needs to get up," he said. "Slowly. You'll have to walk him. At least an hour, probably 2. No lying down." "I'll walk him," Clara said. "Clara," Ethan said. She looked at him. "You've been on your knees on that floor for an hour," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll walk him." Something moved through Ethan's face. He didn't argue. Getting Obsidian up took all 3 of them. Clara at the halter, Ethan and Doc Hale encouraging from behind, and when the horse finally lurched to his feet, it was with the awkward, desperate heaving of an animal that has forgotten what upright feels like. He stood swaying for a moment, and Clara was right there, her hand on his neck, talking, always talking, and he found his legs. She walked him for 2 hours, around and around the yard in the long, slow circles that push a horse's gut back into function in the summer heat that was still sitting heavy even as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Ethan walked beside her for the first hour. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He was just there, matching her pace occasionally, reaching out to lay a hand on Obsidian's flank to check his breathing, and the 3 of them moved in a circle that felt after a while like its own kind of language. It was during that hour that Gideon made his move. She didn't know it was happening until after it had already happened. While she and Ethan were in the yard with the horse, Gideon had gone to Cal and Denny and 2 of the newer hands and told them something. She didn't know the exact words. She pieced it together later from what Hector told her, because Hector had been near enough to hear and had not been fooled by what Gideon was doing. What Gideon told them was this: that Doc Hale had said the horse was too far gone, and that Cole was only walking him because the woman had gotten into his head, and that a working ranch couldn't afford to lose productive afternoon labor to a doomed animal on account of a stranger who'd been there less than a week. He told them that if they backed him on it, he could convince Cole to cut the losses and let Hale do what needed doing. What Gideon was doing in the plainest terms was building a vote, trying to make Ethan Cole feel outnumbered in his own yard. Clara found out because Hector came to her. He appeared at her elbow during the second hour of walking when Ethan had gone to speak with Doc Hale about aftercare, and Hector fell into step beside her and said low and urgent, "Miss Clara, Burke's talking to the hands. He's trying to get them to push Cole to put the horse down." She kept walking. Her pace didn't change. "How many? Cal and Denny, maybe. Not Walt, not me." "Does Mr. Cole know?" "Not yet." She thought for 3 full strides. "Thank you, Hector," she said. "Keep walking normally. Don't let Burke know you told me." Hector nodded and peeled away. Clara kept walking Obsidian, and she watched Ethan Cole across the yard, and she felt something harden in her chest. Not anger exactly. Anger was too hot for what this was. This was colder. This was the feeling of understanding exactly what someone is, and deciding exactly what to do about it. When Ethan came back, he fell into step beside her again. "Doc Hale says another 30 minutes, and we can put him in the stall," he said. "Gideon is talking to some of the hands," she said. "He's trying to build enough voices to push you toward putting Obsidian down." Ethan's stride didn't break, but something in his body changed, a tightening quick and total. "Who told you?" he said. "Doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is you know." A pause. "Cal and Denny," he said. "Possibly." He nodded once, and the nod was slow and deliberate, the nod of a man filing information in a place he intends to return to. They walked another full circle in silence. Then Ethan said, "What do you think, honestly? Is he worth saving?" She looked at Obsidian, who was walking with increasing steadiness, now his head coming up by degrees, his breathing settling. "Yes," she said. "But I think you already know that. I think you asked me because you wanted to hear someone else say it." Ethan Cole was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the silence became its own answer. "My wife," he said, "was afraid of horses. Thought that was something I'd change her out of eventually. Turned out I didn't have eventually as long as I thought." Clara waited. She did not fill the silence with anything, because she understood that what he was about to say had been sitting in him for a long time and needed exactly this much space. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "Fever. Quick. The kind of quick that doesn't give you time to say what you need to say." He exhaled. "I bought Obsidian 6 months later. Don't know exactly why. Grief does strange things to a man's decision-making." "Maybe you bought him because you needed something that needed you back," Clara said. "And Obsidian needs someone badly enough. He's just afraid to need anyone." Ethan Cole stopped walking. Just for a second, one full stop in the middle of the yard in the last light of that long, hard day, and then he started again, and when he spoke his voice was lower than it had been before. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe that's it." They finished the walk. They put Obsidian in the stall with fresh water and clean bedding and the low lamp burning at the end of the barn, so he wouldn't be in total dark. Doc Hale confirmed the crisis had passed. The horse would need monitoring and light feed for several days, but the blockage had moved, and his gut was working, and his eyes had gone from frightened to tired, which was an improvement no one had to explain. Clara was standing outside the stall, her back against the wall, when Gideon made his final approach of the night. He came with Cal and Denny behind him. Not a crowd, but enough to create the feeling of one. "Cole," Gideon said, and his voice carried the specific quality of a man who has rehearsed this. "I need to talk to you about this situation." Ethan turned. He was leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed, looking more tired than Clara had seen him. but his eyes were fully awake. "Go ahead," he said. "The horse nearly killed itself tonight," Gideon said. "We spent the whole afternoon on one animal when we had work that didn't get done. Doc Hale's visit cost money we didn't budget for, and I've got men who are wondering whether this operation is being run on sound judgment or on sentiment." He paused. Let the words sit there. "And I think we need to talk about other decisions that have been made this week that some of us have concerns about." He didn't look at Clara. He didn't have to. Ethan Cole let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "Cal, Denny." The brothers straightened. "Do you have concerns about how this operation is being run?" he said. Cal looked at Denny. Denny looked at his boots. Cal said, "Gideon said." "I'm asking you," Ethan said, not Gideon. "Do you have concerns?" A pause. Cal's jaw moved. "No, sir," he said finally. "I reckon not." Ethan looked at Denny. Denny shook his head without looking up. Ethan looked back at Gideon. "Gideon," he said, "the horse is alive. Doc Hale says he'll recover. The work that didn't get done today will get done tomorrow. And I will run this operation on whatever judgment I see fit, which is what I've done for 11 years and what I intend to go on doing." He paused. "Do you have a problem with that?" Gideon's face had done something difficult, all the calculation failing at once, leaving something rawer and uglier underneath. "No," he said. "Good," Ethan said. "Then I'll see you at breakfast." Cal and Denny disappeared fast the way young men disappear when they realize they've been used for something they don't want to be part of. Gideon left slower with the careful walk of a man recalibrating in real time. The barn went quiet. Clara let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than she'd realized. Ethan Cole turned and looked at her. Just looked for a moment, the way he had that morning, across the body of the horse, unguarded, open, honest. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't do anything," she said. "You warned me," he said. "And you kept that horse calm for 3 hours, when nobody else on this ranch could have gotten within 10 feet of him." He paused. "Don't tell me that's nothing." She looked down at her hands. They were dirty from hours in the barn, scraped at the knuckles from the halter buckle, trembling very slightly now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. She had not noticed the trembling until this moment. "He trusted me," she said. "That's all. He decided to trust me, and I tried to be worth it." "That's not a small thing," Ethan said. "Deciding to trust something after everything's gone wrong. That's about the hardest thing there is." She looked up at him. And Ethan Cole was not looking at the horse when he said it. The lamp at the end of the barn threw a long light down the aisle, and Obsidian stood in his stall, without pacing, without crashing, without the desperate, restless movement that had defined every hour of his time on this ranch. He stood still and breathed, and every now and then he turned his head toward the sound of Clara's voice, even though she was no longer speaking. He was listening for her. Even in the quiet, he was listening for her. Ethan Cole looked at that horse for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then he did something she had not seen him do once in 5 days on this ranch. He almost smiled. It didn't complete itself. It got partway there and stopped the way a man stops who has forgotten the motion and then remembered it unexpectedly and isn't sure yet whether he can afford it. But it was there. She saw it. "Get some sleep," he said. "You've earned it." She pushed off the wall. She was more tired than she had words for. Her knees ached from the stall floor, and her shoulders ached from the halter, and her whole body felt the specific weight of hours of sustained alertness finally releasing. She walked toward the barn door and then stopped. "Mr. Cole," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever Gideon is calculating," she said, "he isn't finished calculating it." Ethan held her gaze. "I know," he said. "All right," she said. "Good night." She walked out into the dark summer night, and behind her in his stall, Obsidian stood without moving. And somewhere deep in the ranch, a coyote called once and then went silent. And the stars above Redemption, Texas were so thick and so bright, they looked like they'd been thrown there by a generous hand. Clara walked back to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of her cot, and finally Finally alone in the dark with no one to keep her face still, for she let herself feel all of it. The grief of the morning she'd arrived and found a dead man's name on a letter. The fear she hadn't shown in Obsidian's stall. The weight of being watched and measured, and found wanting by people who hadn't bothered to look. The particular terrifying tenderness of Ethan Cole's voice when he said what happened to him wasn't his fault. She sat with all of it for a while, in the honest dark of that small room. And then she lay down and closed her eyes, and for the first time since the wagon had rolled into redemption, she slept without listening for trouble. She had earned this one night of peace. She did not yet know that Gideon Burke in his own quarters across the yard was writing a letter. She found out about the letter on a Tuesday, Walt told her. He came to her at the water barrel before breakfast with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something uncomfortable and has decided the carrying is worse than the telling. "Burke sent a letter into town 4 days ago," Walt said. "I didn't know what was in it until yesterday. One of the hands who rides the mail route told me." He paused. "He wrote to Harold Dean's cousin, the one in Georgia." Clara went still. "What did he write?" she said. "That there's a woman on the Cole ranch claiming she was Dean's intended," Walt said. "That she arrived with no proof of the engagement and has been working her way into Cole's confidence. That the cousin may want to look into whether there are assets or arrangements she's positioned herself to benefit from." The morning air sat between them. "He told the cousin I'm a fraud," Clara said. "He implied it," Walt said. "Which is worse in some ways, harder to argue against an implication." Clara looked at the water barrel for a moment. The letter she had read so many times, the folds had gone white. Harold Dean's letter, the matchmaking agency's correspondence. Every document she'd brought from St. Louis was in her bag, in the end room of the bunkhouse, with the broken clasp she'd never gotten fixed. "Has the cousin written back?" she said. "Don't know," Walt said. "I'm sorry, Miss Clara. I thought you should know." "You were right," she said. "Thank you, Walt." He put his hat back on and went inside, and Clara stood at the water barrel and understood with complete clarity what Gideon Burke had done and why he'd done it. He had not tried to get rid of her through Ethan Cole directly. Not after the yard confrontation had failed. Not after Obsidian's recovery had shifted the ground beneath his feet. He had gone around Ethan entirely. He had introduced doubt from the outside, from a direction Ethan couldn't easily defend, and he had done it through a stranger with a legal and financial interest in believing the worst. It was smart. She had to give him that. It was exactly the move of a man who understood that the fastest way to undermine someone's position was not to attack it head-on, but to make the person they depended on question the ground they were standing on. She went to breakfast. She ate everything on her plate. She did not let her face show a single thing. After breakfast, she went to the barn, and she went to Obsidian's stall, and she stood outside it, and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and his ears were forward, and his breathing was even, and he was by any measure that mattered recovering. 3 days past the crisis, and he was eating again, standing without the trembling, watching her with that steady, assessing attention that had over the past week become something she looked forward to in the morning, the way some people look forward to coffee. "We've got a problem," she told him quietly. He blinked. "I know," she said. "We'll figure it out." She heard boots on the barn floor and turned. Ethan Cole was standing 10 feet away. He had come in quietly, or she had been too lost in thought to hear him, and he was looking at her with an expression that had something new in it. Something she couldn't quite read. "The cousin wrote back," he said. She waited. "He wrote to me," Ethan said. "Not to Burke. To me directly. Must have made some inquiries about who actually owned the ranch." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He didn't offer it to her. He held it and looked at it. "He says he has questions about your status here and your intentions regarding any assets connected to Harold Dean's estate." "I have no interest in Harold Dean's estate," Clara said. "I know that," Ethan said. "Do you?" He looked up at her. "Yes," he said, flat and certain the way he said things that weren't in question for him. She let out a breath. "I have documentation," she said. "The agency's letter, The correspondence, everything. It's in my bag. I've had it since St. Louis. I don't need to see it, he said. Ethan. She said his name the same way she'd shouted it in the barn the night Obsidian fell without reaching for it, just the first thing that came. You should see it. Not because I think you doubt me. Because when the cousin pursues this further, and you'll need to have seen it. Something moved through his expression. The slight surprise of a man who has been thought of carefully. All right, he said. She went and got the bag. She brought it to the barn and spread the documents on the hay bale she'd sat on that first morning with the ledger, and Ethan Cole read every page with the focused attention of a man who does not skim things that matter. When he was done, he folded them in the same folds they'd come in and handed them back to her. The agency's stamp and date are clear, he said. The correspondence is thorough. Any reasonable person looking at this sees exactly what it is. Harold Dean's cousin may not be a reasonable person, she said. Or he may be reasonable and still see an opportunity. For what? I don't know yet, she said. But Gideon didn't write that letter without a reason, and the reason wasn't just to get rid of me. There's something else. Ethan was quiet. He looked at the stall where Obsidian stood watching both of them. Gideon's been my foreman for 4 years, he said. He came with good references, and he runs a tight operation. A pause. But I've noticed the last year or so, small things. The way the books occasionally don't balance the way they should. Supply orders that come in short. Things I gave benefit of the doubt to because the overall operation was running. Clara looked at him. Have you checked the books recently? Not with fresh eyes, he said. Let me look at them, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant thing to ask. I know, she said. I've been keeping the feed ledger for a week and you haven't found a single error. I'm asking for the operational books, not to expose anyone, just to look. Another silence, longer this time. After supper, he said. Come to the house. She nodded. He picked up his hat from the hay bale and put it on. He paused. Clara, he said, the first time he'd used her name without a title. She looked at him. Whatever Burke's done, he said, it doesn't change what you've done here. The hands see it. I see it. A letter to a cousin in Georgia doesn't change what's real. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, she said. He walked out. She turned back to Obsidian, who was still watching the place where Ethan had been standing. I know, she said quietly. Me too. Supper that night was tense in the invisible way that suppers get tense when something is happening that nobody's naming. Gideon sat at his end of the table and ate without speaking, but his eyes moved to Clara, to Walt, to Hector, reading the room the way a gambler reads a table. He was looking for what had shifted, and he couldn't quite find it. Hector caught Clara's eye once and gave the smallest nod. He knew something was moving. He didn't know what, but he was on the right side of it, and he wanted her to know that. Cal and Denny ate fast and left. They'd been doing that since the night Ethan had shut Gideon down in the barn, eating fast, and leaving, keeping their distance from a situation they'd come too close to, and were now quietly backing away from. After supper, Clara went to the house. Ethan Cole's house was not a complicated place inside. It was clean in the way that a man alone keeps things clean, functional, without softness, every object in it earning its place. He had the operational books spread on the table already. 2 years' worth, plus the supply ledgers. She sat down and started with the most recent month and worked backward. Ethan sat across from her and worked on something of his own. She didn't look up to see what. And the lamp between them burned steady, and the only sound was the scratch of her pen and the occasional turn of a page. She found the first discrepancy 40 minutes in. Here, she said. Ethan came around the table. She pointed. Supply order from March, she said. 40 pounds of oats, billed 20, recorded as received in the feed log. I set up the feed log when I took it over, but this notation was already there. Someone reconciled the delivery and wrote 20, but the payment went out for 40. Ethan studied the line. His jaw tightened. Could be a delivery error, he said. Supplier shortchanged the order. Could be, she said. Look at April. He looked. She showed him 3 more. Feed fence wire medical supplies. All the same pattern billed for more than recorded as received payment issued for the full billed amount. Each discrepancy small enough to miss individually. Together, they added up to something that made Ethan Cole go very still in a way she hadn't seen before. How long? He said. His voice was quiet. The dangerous kind of quiet. I need another hour with the books to know for certain, she said. But what I'm seeing goes back at least 14 months. He straightened up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hands loose at his sides, and the stillness in him was the stillness of a man absorbing something that is restructuring what he thought he knew. He's been skimming, Ethan said. Small amounts. Consistent. Designed to stay below the threshold you'd notice on a given month. She paused. Whoever did this knows how you manage your books, knows where you look and where you don't. Gideon manages the supply orders, Ethan said. Has since he arrived. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The letter to the cousin, Clara said carefully. What if it wasn't just about me? Ethan turned from the window. What if he wanted to create a situation, she said, where your attention was pulled toward a legal dispute, your reputation was complicated, and the ranch's financial records might end up under outside examination that he could prepare for if he knew it was coming. She met his eyes. A man who knew the books were going to be scrutinized might want to have someone else blamed for the irregularities first. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. He was going to blame you, Ethan said. He was laying the groundwork for it, she said. New woman arrives with questionable status, gets access to the books, discrepancies are discovered. Who gets blamed? Ethan Cole's expression did something she had not seen it do before. It went cold. Not the careful blankness that was different. This was colder than that and deeper, and it had nothing uncertain in it. Where is he now? He said. Bunkhouse, she said. It's nearly 9. Finish with the books, he said. Write down everything you found. Every discrepancy, every date, every amount. He picked up his hat. I'll talk to him in the morning, in front of everyone. Ethan. She said it the same way as before without reaching. Don't go to him tonight. He looked at her. Tonight you're angry, she said. Rightfully, but angry is what he'd expect. In the morning with the numbers written down and Walt as a witness, you have something that can't be argued with. Tonight you just have your word against his. The muscle in his jaw moved, once. In the morning, he said. In the morning, she said. He put his hat on and went out the back, and she heard him walk toward the barn toward Obsidian. She understood, because that was what he did when he needed somewhere to put something too large for a house. She turned back to the books and worked for another hour and wrote down everything she found in her clean, careful hand, and when she was done, the total came to slightly over $200 across 14 months, which was not a fortune, but was real money, real theft, and real betrayal. She walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark and did not sleep well. Morning came fast and hard and clear. She was at the barn before anyone else. Obsidian greeted her with his head over the door before she'd taken 3 steps inside, and she pressed her hand to his nose and felt the warmth of him and steadied herself against it. Today's a hard day, she told him, but it's an honest one. He breathed against her palm. By the time the hands came to breakfast, Ethan was already in the yard. He was standing in the center of it, which was not where he usually stood in the morning, and the deliberateness of his position was enough to make every man who came out of the bunkhouse slow his pace and read the situation. Gideon came out last. He saw Ethan. He saw Clara beside him standing back 1 step, not central, but present. He saw Walt on the other side. He saw the folded paper in Ethan's hand. His face did not show fear. It showed the thing that comes before fear in a man who is calculating the rapid assessment of available exits. There were none. Gideon, Ethan said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The yard was so quiet that the word carried to every corner of it. I want to talk to you about the supply accounts. Gideon's chin came up. I run those accounts clean, he said. I've got 14 months of discrepancies that say otherwise, Ethan said. He didn't unfold the paper, he just held it. Feed fence wire medical supplies. Billed for amounts that weren't delivered. Payment issued for the full billed amount. Consistent small and consistent enough to look like errors until you line them up. Those are delivery errors, Gideon said. I've reported supplier problems before. You can check. I did check, Ethan said. I checked against the supplier's own receipts this morning. Wrote out at first light. Their records show they delivered exactly what they invoiced. He paused. The shortfall happened between the delivery and the record. Gideon's jaw moved. His eyes cut to Clara. She did this, he said. She's been in your books and she's setting me up. You brought a stranger onto this ranch and gave her access to... Clara found it, Ethan said. I looked at it myself. Walt looked at it this morning. The numbers don't change depending on who's reading them. Walt said from his place beside Ethan. I've been here 11 years, Gideon. I know what I'm looking at. That landed. She could see it land the specific moment when Gideon understood that the ally he might have expected in Walt was not there. Cal and Denny had gone very still. Hector had his arms crossed and his face set in the expression of a young man who had already made his decision and was not moving from it. The letter you sent to Harold Dean's cousin, Ethan said. That was to set up an explanation, something to point to if the books ever came to light. That letter was a lie, Ethan said. Clara has full documentation of her engagement and her arrival. The agency's correspondence, Dean's own letters, everything. I've seen it. There's nothing questionable about her status here, except what you put in that letter. Gideon looked at Clara then, and what was in his face had finally dropped the calculation entirely and become something more honest, a raw, ugly anger. The anger of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he had never taken seriously. You had no right to be here, he said. It was not to Ethan. It was to her. Clara looked at him steadily. I had every right, she said. I asked for honest work at fair wages, and I did it. That's all the right I needed. Gideon looked back at Ethan. He seemed to be assembling something, one last argument, one last position. Then the assembling stopped. His shoulders dropped by a fraction, and in that fraction was every admission he would never make with words. I want you off this property by noon, Ethan said. I'll have your wages to the end of the month ready inside the hour. What's owed to you, you'll get. What you took, I won't pursue through the law if you're gone by noon and gone cleanly. It was more than generous. Clara thought Gideon knew it even now. Ethan Cole was not a man who enjoyed destroying people. He was a man who removed what had damaged the structure and rebuilt. Gideon said nothing. He went back into the bunkhouse to pack his things. The yard held its silence for a moment. Then Cal let out a long breath and said to no one in particular, Should have seen that coming. You did see it coming, Denny said. That's why we ate fast and kept our heads down. Walt made a sound that might have been a laugh. Hector looked at Clara with an expression she recognized, the same one he'd had after the farrier, after Obsidian's stall, after every moment when what she'd done had required him to revise what he'd thought was possible. Ethan turned to her. Around them, the yard was beginning to move again. The business of the morning resuming the particular resilience of working people who have dealt with a crisis and are now getting on with the day. I owe you an apology, he said. She blinked. For what? For taking 4 years to notice what was in my own books, he said. And for the fact that you've been on this ranch a week and you saw it before I did. You trusted someone, she said. That's not something to apologize for. Maybe not, he said. But I'm going to do better. He looked at her with that open, careful quality that she'd seen breaking through more and more the warmth beneath the stillness. Starting with the person running my accounts. Clara looked at him. Are you offering me a position? I'm offering you a permanent one, he said, if you want it. Stables accounts, whatever you'll take. He paused. This is a working ranch and it needs capable people. I've got one right here, and I'd be a fool to let the situation stay uncertain. She thought about this boarding house in St. Louis, with the lock that didn't catch. She thought about the wagon rolling into redemption, and the reverend with his hat in his hands. She thought about the mercantile woman, and the two women whispering on the street, and every door that had been closed before she'd finished her sentence. She thought about Obsidian's head over the stall door that first morning, both ears forward, deciding. "Yes," she said. "I want it." Ethan Cole nodded once. He put his hand out. Not the way a man offers his hand to close a deal, though it was that too. The way a man offers his hand to someone he is genuinely glad to have standing beside him. She shook it. His grip was firm and warm, and he held on for exactly 1 second longer than a business handshake required. Neither of them mentioned that. Gideon Burke rode out at 11:45. He did not look back. The yard watched him go with the quiet collective exhale of people who have set down a weight they'd been carrying longer than they'd realized. Walt sat at her shoulder. 11 years. Never thought I'd be glad to see the back of a foreman. Was he always like that? Clara asked. Walt considered. He was always ambitious, he said. I think somewhere along the way he decided that other people's success was the reason for his own limitations. That kind of thinking rots a man from the inside. Clara watched the dust settle where Gideon had gone. Yes, she said. It does. She went to the barn. Obsidian was at his door, head up, watching the yard with the alert attention of an animal who senses that the air has changed. She put her hand on his nose. It's over, she told him. He breathed against her palm, slow and even, and the quality of his stillness was entirely different from the stillness he'd had when she arrived. That stillness had been the coiled, exhausted stillness of an animal waiting for the next bad thing. This was something else. This was the stillness of a creature beginning slowly and with great care to believe that not everything that came next had to be survived. She understood that feeling completely. The week after Gideon left was the quietest the Cole Ranch had been in longer than any of the hands could clearly remember. Not empty quiet. Working quiet. The kind that settles over a place when the friction has been removed and everyone is surprised to discover how much energy they'd been spending on it without knowing. Cal and Denny worked harder than they had in months and didn't seem to notice they were doing it. Hector sang sometimes while he worked low and tuneless, the kind of singing a person does when they've stopped bracing for something. Walt moved through his days with the unhurried ease of a man who has been quietly right about something for a long time and is content to let the proof speak for itself. Clara noticed all of it. She noticed everything. It was simply how she was built, the same way some people are built for speed or for stillness. She noticed and she filed it, and she let it settle into the picture she was assembling of this place. And these people, this life that had arrived so differently than she'd planned for, and had turned out to be something she hadn't known she was capable of wanting. She was 3 weeks in when the cousin arrived. His name was Robert Dean, and he came from Georgia with a lawyer's letter in his breast pocket and the expression of a man who had decided something before he'd gotten off the stage. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for a man traveling with a neat mustache and eyes that moved quickly over everything they landed on, assigning value. Clara was in the barn when Walt came to tell her. She was working with Obsidian, not training, not pushing, just the daily business of being near him, brushing out his coat with long, slow strokes while he stood with his head low and his eyes half closed in the way he'd recently begun doing a posture she had never seen on him before, and that Walt, the first time he witnessed it, had stopped walking to stare at. He's relaxed, Walt had said in the tone of a man reporting something he wouldn't have believed if he hadn't seen it himself. He's decided it's safe to be, Clara had said. Now Walt stood at the barn door and said, Man just rode in on the noon stage. Says he's Harold Dean's cousin. He's at the house with Cole. Clara set the brush down. She looked at Obsidian, who opened one eye and looked back at her. All right, she said. She washed her hands at the trough and straightened her dress and walked to the house without hurrying, because hurrying would have suggested she had something to be afraid of, and she had decided somewhere between Missouri and Texas and every hard day since that she was done performing fear for people who hadn't earned the right to see it. Ethan answered the door before she knocked. He'd been watching for her, she understood. Clara, he said. He stepped back to let her in, and in the gesture the way he positioned himself as he opened the door slightly forward between her and whatever was inside. She read something that settled warm in her chest and stayed there. Robert Dean was standing by the table. He was taller than she'd expected, and the lawyer's letter was already out of his pocket, held in one hand. The way men hold documents they believe give them authority. He looked at her, and the assessment was immediate and complete and unflattering. "Miss Everett," he said. "Mr. Dean," she said. "I'll be direct," he said. "I received correspondence suggesting your presence here is irregular, that the nature of your arrangement with my cousin Harold was not what you've represented, and that your current position on this property may reflect an attempt to—" "I have the documentation," Clara said. She had brought her bag. She set it on the table and opened it and laid out every piece of paper in the order she'd organized them weeks ago for Ethan agency correspondence. Harold Dean's own letters, the matchmaking contract with its stamp and date. Agency letter dated March 14th. Your cousin's first letter to me dated March 21st. His second letter, April 3rd, confirming the arrangements. The agency's contract signed by Harold Dean on April 9th. She spread them in a clean line. I arrived in Redemption on June 2nd. Your cousin died on May 30th. I did not know until I stepped off the wagon. Robert Dean looked at the documents. His eyes moved over them with the practiced speed of a man who knew what he was looking for. The lawyer's letter in his hand lowered by 1 inch. "The correspondence that prompted your visit," Ethan said from behind her, "came from a man who was stealing from this operation and needed a distraction. He's no longer employed here." A pause. "I've written out a summary of the discrepancies in the accounts if you'd like to see how the situation actually stood." Robert Dean looked from the documents to Ethan to Clara. Something in his face was recalibrating not gracefully, because men who arrive with conclusions rarely recalibrate gracefully, but honestly. "You have no claim on Harold's estate," he said to Clara. It was half statement, half question. "I never did," she said. "I came here to be a wife, and I arrived to a funeral I wasn't invited to. I found work because I needed to survive. That's the whole of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Harold wrote to me about the advertisement," he said then, and his voice had shifted, something personal coming into it unexpected. "Said he'd answered it on a whim and then surprised himself by hoping it would work out. He was lonely. After Margaret died, he was very lonely." He stopped. "I didn't know him as well as I should have." The room held that for a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said. She meant it. Robert Dean looked at her. Whatever he'd brought with him from Georgia, the suspicion, the ready argument the lawyer's letter held like a weapon, had not survived contact with the actual facts of her, and she could see him understanding that. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. "The estate is settled," he said. "There's nothing here that involves you legally, Miss Everett. I can see that." He picked up Harold's first letter from the table and looked at it for a moment, and something moved through his face that was private, and she didn't try to read it. He set it back down. "I'm sorry you made this journey for what you found." "I'm not," she said. He looked up. "I found work I'm good at," she said, "and people worth working alongside. I'm sorry about Harold Dean, but I'm not sorry I'm here." Robert Dean looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked at the way the two of them were standing. Clara at the table. Ethan a step behind, and to her left, the specific geometry of people who have learned to trust each other in close quarters. And something moved through the cousin's expression that might have been understanding, or might have been something closer to envy, the quiet kind that a person feels when they recognize something they wish they had. He nodded once. "Good day, Miss Everett," he said. "Mr. Cole." He left. They heard his boots on the porch, and then crossing the yard toward the stable where his hired horse was waiting. Ethan and Clara stood in the house, and neither of them moved for a moment. "That's over," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. She started gathering the documents back into her bag. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. She'd noticed that about herself a long time ago, that she steadied in a crisis and only trembled after. "Clara," Ethan said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression that had been building for 3 weeks, the one that had started as a crack in the careful stillness, and had been opening by degrees, the way a door opens when someone on the other side has finally decided it's all right to push through. "Stay," he said. She looked at him. "I have a permanent position," she said. We shook on it. "That's not what I mean," he said. The room was very quiet. She held his gaze and let the words sit between them, the way she'd learned to let silence sit, not filling it, not rushing it, just giving it the space it needed to be what it was. "I know what you mean," she said. "Then tell me what you think about it," he said. She thought about the photograph she'd carried across 3 states. The photograph of a stranger she'd tried to build a future around because she'd had no other offer of one. She thought about what it meant to choose a life versus being assigned one, and she thought about the difference between arriving somewhere because you had no choice and staying somewhere because it had become the truest thing you'd found. "I think," she said slowly, "that I came here with nothing and I've built something. And I'm not willing to give it up because someone else is afraid of it, or threatened by it, or confused by it." She paused. "That includes you." Ethan Cole looked at her. "I'm not afraid of it," he said. "You've been careful with it," she said, "every day, and I understand that. You lost someone, and it cost you in ways I can only see the outside of. I know what it costs to open a door you closed for good reasons." She held his eyes. "I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to keep going." He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to look up, and the quality of his attention at this distance was something entirely different from across a barn or across a yard. It was particular and warm and entirely focused, and she had not had anyone look at her quite like that in longer than she could remember, if ever. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks," he said. "Every day. I've watched you walk into things that had broken better people, and come out the other side still standing, still clear-eyed, still—" He stopped. Started again. "I didn't expect you. I didn't expect any of this. I don't have a speech prepared." "Good," she said. "I don't want a speech." "What do you want?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without sentiment, without performance, just the clean, clear truth of it. "I want to keep the accounts," she said. "I want to keep working with Obsidian. I want to learn this land the way I've been learning it properly all the way through." She paused. "And I want to stop pretending that I don't notice when you're standing next to me in the barn at 6 in the morning, and neither of us has anything left to say about the horses." His mouth moved. The almost smile she'd seen in the barn the night Obsidian recovered it completed itself this time. It was not a big smile. It was the smile of a man who has been serious for a long time, and remembers unexpectedly that he doesn't have to be. "Neither do I," he said. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. Just one gesture, careful and deliberate, and asking nothing beyond itself. And she felt it the way you feel the first real rain after a long dry summer, not violent, just the enormous relief of something that was needed finally arriving. She covered his hand with hers before he could pull it back. They stood like that for a moment. "I should check on Obsidian," she said. "You should," he agreed. Neither of them moved. Then she laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and she felt the surprise of it in her own chest, the way you're surprised by warmth after cold. Ethan Cole smiled. The full version this time, no hesitation. It changed his face completely, the way sunlight changes a room it's been kept out of. She went to the barn. Obsidian was at his door. He'd heard her coming. He always heard her coming. Now had cataloged the specific sound of her walk somewhere in whatever part of a horse holds the things it has decided to trust. His ears came forward, and his head lifted, and he made a low sound in his chest that was not quite a nicker and not quite a sigh, but somewhere between the two. "I know," she said. She pressed her forehead to the broad plane of his face and felt the warmth of him. It worked out. He breathed against her. She stood there for a long time, her forehead against his, her hand on his neck, and let the fullness of it land the whole strange, painful, unexpected arc of it from the wagon rolling into redemption, to this barn, to this horse, to this life that was not the one she'd planned for, and was so much better than anything she'd planned for that she could not have imagined it from where she'd started. She had come with nothing. That was still true. What was also true was that she had built something with that. Nothing. Not because anyone had given it to her, not because circumstances had arranged themselves in her favor, not because she'd been lucky, or pretty, or connected. She had built it with her hands and her mind and her willingness to walk into things that scared her and keep walking. That was worth something. More than something. She was still there, her forehead against obsidians, when she heard boots on the barn floor and knew them without looking. She'd cataloged that sound too, somewhere in the part of her that held what she'd decided to trust. Ethan stopped beside her. He put his hand on Obsidian's neck next to hers, and the stallion who 4 weeks ago would have put a man through a wall for getting this close stood perfectly still and let him. The three of them stayed like that for a while. Cal asked me this morning who was going to be running the stable accounts now that Burke's gone, Ethan said. What did you tell him? Clara said. I told him that was already settled, he said. She smiled against Obsidian's face. Walt asked me something else, Ethan said. What? A pause. He asked me if I was going to do something about the situation before someone with more sense than me figured out what was standing right in front of them and made a better offer. Clara lifted her head and looked at Ethan Cole. He was watching her with those careful, warm, entirely honest eyes, and in them she could see the full length of what it had cost him to get here. The 3 years of grief, the 4 months of a horse. He couldn't reach the long practiced discipline of keeping everything inside the lines, and she could see that he was done with all of that. Not because it had stopped being hard, because she was worth the difficulty of stopping. Walt's a smart man, she said. Smartest one on the property, Ethan said. Always has been. Then you should probably listen to him, she said. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced something small, a ring, plain silver, worn smooth, the kind of ring that had been someone's before, and carried the weight of that without apology. Her breath caught. This was my mother's, he said. She gave it to me when she died, said to give it to someone who'd earned it. He held it between them, not offering it yet, just showing her. I think she'd have liked you. You don't have to, she started. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. There's a difference. He looked at her steadily. I know this isn't what you came here for. I know you came for a stranger's photograph and a fresh start, and it went sideways before you'd taken 3 steps off the wagon. I know I'm asking you to stay for something you didn't plan. He paused. But I'm asking. Obsidian shifted slightly beside them. His head came around, and he looked at Clara with both ears forward in the listening posture that she had come to understand meant he was paying full attention. Even the horse was waiting. She looked at the ring, and she looked at Ethan Cole, and she thought about plans, the ones you make, and the ones that get made for you, and the ones that arrive sideways on a wagon you didn't choose and turn out to be the truest ones. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit as though it had been waiting for her hand specifically. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Obsidian pushed his nose firmly against Clara's shoulder. He's congratulating you, Ethan said. He's telling me to stop standing still and get back to work, she said. Ethan laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a real one, full and unhurried, and it sounded like something that had been locked up for a long time, finally finding the door open. She took his hand, and they walked out of the barn together into the summer morning, into the full working noise of a ranch that was breathing easier than it had in years. Where Walt was whistling something off-key by the water barrel, and Hector was arguing cheerfully with Cal about the right way to mend a fence post, and Denny was pretending he wasn't listening to either of them. It was ordinary, and it was good, and it was hers. Clara Everett had ridden into Redemption, Texas with $11 a bag with a broken clasp and a dead man's photograph. She had been turned away from every door in town. She had been lied about, set up, underestimated, and sent into a stall with a horse that had put men in the infirmary. She had not flinched once. Not because she wasn't afraid. She had been afraid plenty in Obsidian's stall, with her heart hammering in her throat in the lamplight over the account books in the yard. with Robert Dean's lawyer's letter pointed at her like a question she hadn't been asked permission to answer. She had been afraid, and she had done it anyway because that was what you did when you had no one to do it for you. You steadied your hands, and you kept your face still, and you walked through the door that everyone said was not for you, and you did it so well, and so honestly, that eventually the door became yours. That was not luck. That was not circumstance. That was not beauty or charm or the right last name or knowing the right people. That was Clara Everett built from the inside out, piece by piece, choice by choice, all the way to the end. She arrived with nothing, and she left a mark on every heart that had doubted her. And the mark she left on the ones that hadn't doubted her at all was the deepest mark of all, the kind that doesn't fade. The kind that becomes part of the shape of a person's life without them ever finding a word sufficient to describe it. She had come as nobody's bride. She stayed as her own woman, and that in the end was everything.